So welcome everyone to tonight's Humanist Australia event. I'll just do a brief introduction for those who might not be familiar with Humanist Australia, and then I'll introduce the talk for tonight and our speaker immediately after that. So welcome everyone. Humanist Australia is a national organisation which launched in December 2020 in response to the growing number of Australians who don't identify as religious and the emerging need to represent the interests of this group and their priorities on a broader scale. We are dedicated to helping people live ethical and meaningful lives through humanism. Through our ceremonies, educational resources, and awareness raising, we help non-religious people discover humanism and humanist values, so that they can live an ethical life full of meaning and fulfillment. Through our campaigns work, we advocate for positive social change. We advocate for rational, evidence-based policies that reduce societal inequalities, advance secularism, advance human rights, and improve quality of life. So thanks again for joining us this evening. I'll introduce our speaker, Dr. Vincent Giuca, shortly. This is his topic. Vince is going to talk to us about humanism and democracy, connecting the dots. While humanists are strong advocates of democracy and allied freedoms of expression and association, the importance of political institutions underpinning these fundamental principles are at times taken for granted. People often make assumptions about what they mean by democracy and its supporting institutions critical for its survival without clearly understanding or at least making explicit what they mean. Vince will open this discussion by asking what is democracy, teasing out the implications of rule of the people and what it means in modern society. He will consider keystone institutions as well as norms that are needed for democracy to operate effectively. A contrast will be made with authoritarian states, where some democratic processes may be superficially evident while lacking real substance. This will be followed with consideration of how democracy is connected to humanism and why humanists value democratic institutions and norms of behavior. After the presentation, there'll be an opportunity for questions first and then discussion regarding Vince's presentation. And finally, before we get to hear from our speaker, a bit about our speaker tonight, Dr. Vincent Giuca. Vince is a member of both Humanists Victoria and Humanists Australia, and recently joined the board of directors of Humanists Australia. In the recent past, Vince taught various postgraduate units at Monash University, including human resources management, negotiations, managing conflict, and organizational behavior. Prior to this, Vince had a long and diverse career in many managerial and advisory roles with a focus on human resources, employee relations, and negotiations, ranging from ministerial advisor within the Hawke government for cabinet ministers, consulting with multinational consultancy firms, human resources manager, and manager owner of a small business. Vince has postgraduate business and management degrees, MA, MBA, and PhD, and continues to have a strong and passionate interest in politics and current affairs, as well as social sciences more generally, reflecting earlier studies in these areas. We are delighted and privileged to have you to address us this evening, Vince. The floor, as they say, is yours.
Thanks, Peter, for that introduction. I'll just share my screen. So you should be able to see my screen now. Yeah, look, welcome everyone, and I'm glad that you could join us. It's a small group, so we'll have more opportunities for discussion, I guess, towards the end. I want to begin this presentation with a brief personal note. My parents came to Australia in the early 1950s from Sicily to start a new life after living through the shocking horrors of the Second World War. They were escaping a world that had been that had seen the rise of and the subsequent demise of fascist and Nazi regimes. While I know that both my parents experienced all sorts of hardships during and after the war, my siblings and I were shielded from a lot of the atrocities that, in particular, my father had to endure. My parents were not the only ones that took the opportunity to come to Australia, and we are extremely grateful for that. Having been born in Australia, I did not directly experience the war traumas, but I was aware of their presence vicariously. There in the background, there were constant reminders. And I'm sure that this has coloured my worldview. For those younger than me, without any connections to what authoritarianism is capable of doing in the world, I wonder whether complacency will become the order of the day, leaving strong democracies weaker. The point I want to emphasise here is that governments do matter, and they matter big time. Governments have a fundamental impact on our daily lives and how we develop as individuals. Whether we are given space and opportunities to flourish or not, governments matter because they are able to influence and at times set the framework by which people live within nation states. And they matter because they are able to launch wars across their state borders and to wreak havoc on or even create existential threat to other nation states. The current Russian-Ukraine war comes to mind. For me, the connection between humanism and democracy is fairly direct. The first, humanism, is a way of life, a way of seeing and experiencing the world around us. The second, democracy, is a way of governing, a way of making decisions for and on behalf of people living within nation states. Democracy, if you like, is the underpinning foundation upon which humanistic life can be built upon. However, the link between the two concepts is more symbiotic than that. Humanism is also capable of affecting and improving the quality of a democracy. For now, it is important to understand in broad terms that the way individuals live their lives will be profoundly affected as well as constrained by the nation state's governing principles, institutions and values. Prominent political protagonists with capabilities to influence and persuade groups of people in a society will also have important implications for how government works or ceases to work and in which direction it goes. So what I want to do next is just briefly situate democracy within humanism. And you can see on the screen there two sets of statements from two organisations. One is the Humanist Australia. This comes from their website. And it says that humanism attempts to build a more humane and democratic society where fulfilment is the goal and the people are treated with dignity and respect and have equal rights and opportunities. And similarly, the Humanist International, in their Amsterdam Declaration only last year, made a similar sort of statement. So I won't go through all these slides in detail, but we can come back to any of these. Anything I miss, we can always come back to during question time and discussion time. Just having been through these preliminary remarks, having put them aside, I just want to turn to the structure of my presentation this evening. So these are the sorts of areas I'm going to be covering. Starting with the historical context, defining democracy. I think it's important to define our terms, what we mean by them. Talk about where democracy sits today, and then talk about some of the complexities and threats to democracy before I come back to the central issue about linking democracy and humanism. And what I'd encourage you to do is ask questions first after the presentation, and then we can have a discussion subsequent to that. I also would add that if there's anything in the presentation that you need clarification on, please interject. It's a small group, so feel free to interject and ask a quick clarifying question if you want to as I'm speaking. Any questions so far? It's clear? Okay. So, look, I had something else to say before we move on to that. So, look, my focus is going to be mainly on democracy today. That's what the bulk of the presentation is going to be about. I'm going to confine my comments to democracy as it relates to nation-state governance and not forms of group decision-making. One point I wish to emphasise from the beginning is that when discussing nation-states, we are not talking about static entities. By their very nature, they are organic and ever-changing, which leads me to another point, which is that nation-states do not evolve in a preordained or predetermined manner, whether it's linear or cyclical. I'm always amused when I listen to cable channels and they're talking about things like the Russian-Ukraine war or the legal cases pending that Trump faces. There's a lot of pundits that with little evidence will try and speculate, and they'll just build stories, and they just don't have sufficient information. In the social sciences, we are dealing with probabilities. I want to stress that nothing is for certain. It's all about probabilities rather than certainties. We are dealing with players whose behaviours and actions, and groups, I should say, whose behaviours and actions are very hard to predict. And sometimes they find it difficult to predict what they're going to do next. So my presentation does, as I was mentioning before, does consist of an awful lot of slides. I'm going to try and skim over some of them, and we can come back to it later on through question time. And I'm also expecting that these slides will be available to you at some future date. Okay, so historically, democracy has been maligned and held in contempt because in the past it was associated with instability and rule of anarchy, or rule by anarchy, I should say. This was certainly the case with Plato. Plato saw democracy as controlled by the ignorant, feckless, and the greedy mob. And Aristotle wasn't too far removed from that as well. He was a bit more cautious, and he thought that having a mixed form of government, perhaps with oligarchy and democracy combined, that would probably lead to good government. Renaissance thinkers also had a similar problem with democracy. They thought that it would cause turmoil. And the American founding fathers also had concerns about the mob rule, and in particular, what that would do to property rights. It wasn't until the 19th century that things started changing, and here we're getting into modern democratic arrangements, where the stability of government started to be perceived as working more effectively. and fairly. And minorities and individual interests were being accommodated more. But I should add that those minority interests were probably more related to the few wealthy individuals and those that had property. It wasn't until the 20th century where the concept of citizenship started to expand and began to be embedded more in terms of the basics of democracy, universal suffrage being a very basic characteristic of democracy. But one thing that's interesting is the appeal of democracy, the current widespread appeal, arguably, but that's been more of a recent phenomenon. Now, I'm talking here once again about modern democracy. In the early part of the 20th century, it started taking off very slowly, and it wasn't until after the Second World War that democracy started to take off in much larger rates. And also, we need to remember that democracy is an ideal. It's an idea that people have fought wars over and died. And the current Russian-Ukraine war is an example of that. And the term also has been hijacked by non-democratic countries. And here are just a few: Franco, Sukarno's, Honecker's and Kim Jong-un all used democracy either as what they were practicing or embedded it within the name of their country. Does this make it devoid of meaning? I don't think so. As long as we can define it, explain the key characteristics, as long as we can use it to differentiate democratic regimes from non-democratic regimes, from those that are authoritarian and totalitarian in nature. And also we need to be able to flesh out those that are phony and sham cases like the ones I've got here on the screen. So if we can do that, then I think democracy as a term can be useful. So where did it begin? It began with the Greeks, and they had the word demokratia, which basically meant, rule by the people. And breaking it down, we see that the people were restricted to adult citizens, i.e. males. It excluded women, children, slaves, foreigners. So the majority of people were actually excluded from Athenian democracy. Rule, it was conducted by direct participation, with the citizens attending assemblies and administrative roles. And those administrative roles were allocated by ballot to stop elites forming. So ancient Greece, the system of government, what's interesting is that even at this early stage, they had checks and balances in their system against abuses of power. They had equal representation between the regions, and citizens were chosen at random through ballot for executive, magistrate and other positions. And in those days, administration was not necessarily very complex. So they thought that everyone is equal and anyone could fit into any of those roles. And participation was considered a civic duty, as a way of gaining virtue. Now, what they meant by virtue was different to what we mean it. Virtue for Pericles was equated to courage. Okay, and the quote here from Pericles in his famous funeral oration speech: "We alone regard a man who takes no interest in public affairs, not as harmless, but as a useless character." So there was an expectation there that, it was your duty, your right, the expectation was there that you would participate in civic life. unless you were one of the excluded lot. Okay, so modern democracy. We're comparing here direct with indirect. Direct democracy is basically the Athenian democracy, where people directly make the determining political decisions, whereas in indirect or representative democracy, the people make the determining political decisions to an important extent, which is through the election of key representatives. Going back to direct democracy, I don't think that it's very practical, given the size and the complexity of modern societies. And Aristotle, for one, agreed with that. He didn't see it going beyond small city-states. The painting up the top there is Tom Roberts. You may be familiar with it, which is the opening of the first Parliament of Australia here in Melbourne in 1901. Okay, so moving on to definitions. I've only selected a few. There's no consensus about how to define or measure democracy. It's a well-contested area. But here are just a few definitions. I won't read out the definitions. I want to focus more on the comments. So Schumpeter's definition, the first one, is concerned with methods and procedures. It's a market-based. Schumpeter was an economist, a political economist. So he had this thing about market-based perspective. It's about leaders seeking votes, and it challenges the classic view of democracy. The next one is about the importance of elections, which is what Schumpeter was on about, but it also adds concepts of fairness, rights, civil liberties. They're all highlighted in this second definition. And then we've got a third one, which is a much broader perspective involving the whole people, decision-making, entitlements, consent and rejection. And problem I have with when we talk about whole people is it's one reading of it. It's not necessarily the right reading for this particular author, but one reading of it, when you sort of start talking about whole people, it's the language that populists use. And populists basically, I'm not going to talk about it here. I haven't got any slides on popularism, but basically it's an idea that that society is homogeneous, and you just need a strong leader to find what the people, the direction, and what the interests of the people are as a whole. And those that don't fit there are considered enemies of the people. So they try and divide, and that's how they conquer. And Mussolini and Hitler did something very similar to that. Okay, so the one that I'm keen on is the Economist Intelligence Unit measures, and we're going to look at some of their polling, or some of the measures they use to decide on how to rank and rate different democracies around the world. But what they use is a set of key measures. But the way they define it is majority rule, consent of the governed, free and fair elections, minority rights, basic human rights. Democracy presupposes equality before the law, due process and political pluralism. And the question that they ask is, are these basic things satisfactory for the concept of democracy? and they comment on thin and thick measures of democracy. And the things that we've got here about the elections, they consider to be basically the thin type of measures. And the thick ones include things like political freedom, civil liberties, political participation, political culture, the functioning of the government. Okay, so they take it one step further. Oops. So the latest survey, and they've been doing these for a number of years, starting in 2012. And this one, 2021, is the latest one, and they've classified this basically covers almost the entire world population. There's only a few that are very small that are left out, but basically covers 167 independent states and territories, and it covers almost the entire population. And what they've done is, by using the democratic index, which is on the right-hand side on the screen here, electoral process and pluralism. So under each of these categories, they've got a whole lot of questions, and they come up with a numbering system and rank the countries accordingly. So each one of these, electoral process and pluralism, functioning of government, political participation, political culture, and civil liberties, they then come up with a measure and then plug that into their model and classification system. And their classification systems are full democracies, flawed democracies, hybrids, and authoritarian regimes. So what's interesting here is that full democracies, the world population, there's only 6.4% in full democracies. Now, full democracies, your question might be which countries are in the full democracy category. And examples include Norway, New Zealand, Finland, Sweden, and Australia. Flawed democracies include France, Israel, Spain, Chile, America, Estonia, Italy, Malta, Greece. Hybrid regimes are Bangladesh, Zimbabwe, Hong Kong, Ukraine, Georgia, and Turkey. And authoritarian are Palestine, Kuwait, Iraq, Russia, Kyrgyzstan, Vietnam, China. Okay. So less than half, 45.7% of the world's population live in a democracy of some sort. There has been a decline since they did this index the year before this one, which was in 2020. And like I said, only 6.4% live in full democracies. Okay. Any questions on that? Yeah. Okay, and in Australia, this is done by the Lowy Institute. They do polls every year. Sorry, I said the other one, I got these confused. It's the Lowy Institute that's been running the polls since 2012. I can't remember offhand when this democracy index started, but it's probably about a similar time span. But I don't have the details right in front of me. But with Australia, what's interesting here is this black line. 3/4 of Australians continue to see democracy as preferable to any other kind of government, and it's essentially unchanged from a year before. And 1 in 5, 19%, say that in some circumstances, a non-democratic form of government would be preferable. And the other interesting thing with this is that the 18 to 44-year-olds are sitting here at 67%, as preferring democracy, and the aged 45 plus are sitting on 78%. So there's a big gap. Used to be much bigger back in 2018. I'm not sure if that was anything to do with the recession we had. Yeah, I would have thought younger people would have been more gung-ho about democracy, but it doesn't seem to be the case. It seems to be the other way around. Okay. So just introducing some of the complexities. So American founding fathers were concerned about factions. So this is the Plato, similar to the Plato type of concerns. And it was used in a similar way that democracy was a pejorative term. Factions in Madison's time was also a pejorative term. And rather than removing the causes of factions, because that would have entailed curtailment of liberties, and that wasn't accepted, Madison focused on the effects of factions. So what would be needed to prevent one group oppressing another? And he concluded that morality or religion was not adequate. And he looked for a sociological and institutional solution. So I've got a quote here from Madison. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, you must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, obligate it to control itself. So you've got two points here that he's making. But the major point was the need to guard parts of society, the minority, against the injustices of the majority. And one thing that he thought would work was the multiplicity of interests that are impermanent and shifting will act to offset each other. The right of individuals or the minority will be in little danger from interested combinations of majority. What that is saying is that he's basically saying shifting alliances and changes that are happening all the time will, to some extent, guarantee that there won't be one single majority that will impose its will on the minority group. And for the institutional or the structural response, it was him saying that ambition must be made to counteract ambition. So the federal form of government, nation states and local jurisdictions competing with each other, was a way of introducing checks and balances, and then separating the different branches of government, national government, into executive, legislature, and judiciary, and this type of structural thing is very similar here in Australia. We've got the very similar breakup structures because we got a lot of our ideas from the American Constitution. The Madisonian Republic was a democratic hybrid, and that's the difference when Americans talk about democracy versus republic. They're talking about the republic because there's checks and balances there to make sure that the majority doesn't overcome minority interests. So representative government's applicable to larger territories and groups of citizens, promises to address factionalism by enlarging the public view, growing population, changing demographics, and where the chosen representatives are chosen based on their wisdom and the general interest of the country. But he did recognise the possibility of elected representatives betraying the general interests of people. But he nevertheless thought that in overall terms it would be more favourable to the public well-being. Another complicating thing is this idea of liberty. And I've got two slides on liberty from different perspectives. This one here, Ancients and Moderns, is Benjamin Constant, a Frenchman. And he was talking about the differentiation between ancients and, in his day, the moderns. And he was basically saying, look, in ancient Greece, for example, it works because the groups are small. There's active and constant participation in collective power, concerns with living in a state that is free from invasion. So for the ancients, liberty meant contributing, participating in collective power. So if you as a citizen were able to participate in the affairs of the state, that was liberty. But liberty also meant freedom from invasion, because you're not going to survive, you're not going to have the freedom if you get invaded by outsiders and turned into a slave. So that's the way the ancients looked at it. The way the moderns look at it is to express the focus on rights, rights of expression, association, religion, rights to be subjected to laws, but not in an arbitrary way. The right to exercise some influence on administration was also important to the moderns. So both types of liberty are needed in the modern world. If you are not interested, this is constant. If you are not interested in the public sphere, it won't leave you alone. Eventually, the state will become coercive and take away your liberties. The paradox of modern life, you need to pay attention to what's going on. Okay, so that's the main message that he has. The other one is Isa Berlin, who wrote about, and he was writing back in 1958, which was after Constant was writing in 1816. So Berlin was talking about negative and positive liberty. So negative liberty is liberty from interference. State activities need to be limited with few restrictions on individuals. And that's normally the way we sort of relate to liberty or freedom. And he also came up with the term positive liberty, which is liberty for self-mastery, self-realization, self-determination. May require considerable state intervention at individual and collective levels. So if you like, the two can be competing notions. One requires a state to butt out, and the other one requires high state intervention. Berlin was, when he was writing, he was putting more emphasis on the negative liberty. He had, the experience of, leaving Germany. No, hang on, he was Russian. But anyway, he had experience with totalitarian regimes, and that's what was primarily driving him. So as an example of negative liberty, I've got there no legal restrictions preventing me from buying a house based on my religion or ethnic background or whatever. Positive liberty is I have the monetary means by which I could buy a specific house. So that's more of a positive. So potentially they're rivals and incompatible. So fairly simple concept or simple concepts, but they hide a plurality of meanings and ideas. So it's also worth keeping that in mind. The benefits of democracy, these are just a few. Citizenship, virtues of community participation, has an educative role, conflict resolution, opportunities for debate and persuasion. There's an electoral process for allowing peaceful transfer of power. Decision-making, arguably you get better decisions. And there's safeguards, possibly, to prevent corruption and sinister interests. And the famous quote from Lord Acton, all power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So, the founding fathers of the American Constitution were well aware of that concept. Okay, so some of the dilemmas of democracy, this is more of a summary thing. We've already spoken about Plato and Aristotle. De Tocqueville wrote his famous work in 2 volumes when he visited America back in the I think it was early 1800s, and he wrote 2 volumes called Democracy in America, which is quite popular and famous piece of work. And but between volumes 1 and 2, he sort of tended to change his mind, because in the first one he was more concerned about majoritarian tyranny, the mobs being out of control. And by the second volume, he was more concerned about the general populace becoming more passive and stale and conformist. So he was these are comments about America when he visited there. The other interesting chap is Carl Schmitt, and he's interesting from a few perspectives, but he was a card-holding Nazi, and he was an academic, and he had a falling out with the Nazi Party and left, and later on he became semi-respectable, and he went on to live a long life, and in universities around the globe, in the politics department, apparently his works are becoming more popular these days. And the thing that I want to just hone in on briefly is we often talk about liberal democracy. Schmitt was basically saying that the concept doesn't hold water, because liberalism and democracy are 2 completely different things, and they are in contradiction with each other, and there's tension there, and they can't coexist. And he's basically saying he was more in favour of democracy because he wanted a strong state that made decisions and went for it. And he's basically saying, look, democracy is more homogeneous. It's about making decisions. You have some discussion, but then once you make your discussion, you get on with it, and you go for it. The majority wins out, that's how decisions are made. Whereas with liberalism, basically there's a lot of discussion that goes on, and if you can't reach a compromise, you have further discussion, and it goes on and on. It basically sees society as being heterogeneous, difficult to make decisions. But yeah, look, I'll leave it at that because it gets more complicated and messy. But basically, I'm bringing up these things because they are potential problematic things for democracy in the way we use it. And finally, representative democracy, the complication there is, and always has been, whose interests do the representatives represent? Okay, so threats to democracy. One book I like is by these two authors, Levitsky and Zimblad. They wrote this in 2000, or was published in 2018. So this was after Trump came to power, and they were focusing on what was going on in America. But I think the two academics have studied and researched. Their background is Latin America, so they're using a lot of examples from that region of the world. But they've basically concluded that democracies have tended to break down from within, not from military interventions, since the Cold War. And paradoxically, authoritarians use the institutions of democracy gradually, subtly, and even legally to kill it off. And you can see, as I'm talking, you might be able to see some of the things that evolved during the Trump period, and that's who they've got in mind when they wrote this. But they give other examples, both historical, Europe in the 30s, Latin America in the 70s, but contemporary countries, Hungary, Turkey, Venezuela, that have moved more towards the authoritarian side. And what they concluded was the American politicians now are treating their rivals as enemies. Now, this is the concept of popularism. Intimidate the press, threaten to reject the results of the elections. They try to weaken the institutional buffers of our democracy, including the courts. So with the courts, you could see the stacking of the Supreme Court. The Republicans stopped Obama's pick 12 months before the end of his term. And yet, when it came to Trump, they were able to put their nominated candidate through the Senate in the intervening periods between the election that Trump lost and the coming to power of Biden. And then at the end of the day, they didn't have any rationale for justifying that, except that they've got the numbers. That's what it boiled down to. So sticking to the same book, indicators of authoritarian behaviour. I won't go through all these in detail. I'll let you read these for yourself later on. But what's important here is that authoritarians will reject or have weak commitment to democratic rules. So they will reject parts of the Constitution or express willingness to violate it. They deny the legitimacy of political opponents. So they describe their rivals as subversive. They're criminals. They whatever. Jailing of let's hang Pence and let's jail what's her name, Hillary Clinton. Those sorts of things are there to discredit political opponents. Toleration of violence. So we saw the violence on the Capitol on the 6th of January. And readiness to curtail civil liberties, including the media. So these are all indicators. They've got a list of questions. The questions may not all fit precisely for a particular country, but these are just indicative of the types of things that you need to ask yourself in terms of whether there's a perceived move towards authoritarian rule. And they also mentioned 3 strategies to bolster their power, and Trump certainly has attempted all 3 of these. Capturing the referees, asking James Comey, when he was FBI director, to drop charges against Michael Flynn, for example, sidelining key players, as sections of the media as being enemies of the people and fake news, rewriting the rules to tilt the playing field against opponents through ID laws, for example, and the appointment of Supreme Court judges. I've mentioned that already. Okay, so what they're saying is basically the checks and balances in the political systems in the past have worked reasonably well, and what authoritarian political players tend to do is start to weaken these. And these are not necessarily just those in the Constitution, but there's the ones that relate to unwritten democratic norms. So every society has got these in some form or another. And what authoritarian leaders will try and do is they try and dismantle not just what's in the Constitution, but they do it more precisely through attacking these norms. And 2 critical norms that these 2 academics have come up with is mutual toleration. Opposing parties accept one another as legitimate rivals. So one of the norms, what they're saying is that there's mutual toleration, that you accept that your opposing party is legitimate. And Trump has tried to delegitimize his opponents. And forbearance. Politicians exercise restraint in the use of institutional prerogatives and rights. So Trump has pushed it as far as he can, particularly with legal measures, taking people to court at every opportunity he can get, the case against Biden's son as well could fall into this category. Okay, so to finish off, what they're basically saying is, look, the US is so divided now that there could be potential existential threat, particularly over issues of race and culture. America's already experienced the Civil War. Could it happen again? And they're saying that the extreme polarization can kill democracies. Okay, so I'm getting towards the end now. Democracy. What I would argue is that it's a package of measures. It's not just one thing, and you need. It's not just electoral process or rule by consent. It's how the government functions, how the different arms of government function, civil liberties, how are they protected, and very importantly, the political culture. This reinforcement of unwritten democratic norms that we just saw. Political leaders acting with mutual tolerance and forbearance. Interest of the people are taken into account, not just the majority. And a narrowing of economic inequalities, because people with money can throw it around and they can get preferential treatment and thus gain more power. So connecting the dots to humanism, I forgot to mention that I've got three dot points here, and each of these, I think I mentioned them earlier on, but I forgot to mention that these came from Les's presentation last time when he was talking about humanism and the good life. So I took the opportunity to look at these key factors that Les was talking about, and using those to link it back to modern democracy. And I think this is probably an area that we may want to get some discussion going. So reason and evidence, truths established through evidence, reason and logic, intuition and faith are not reliable guides to knowledge. In a democracy, the important precept is to have open access to information so that people can make informed decisions. Fake news is antithetical, but is often present. So you need to have, an ability. People need. That's why participating in or at least understanding what's going on in the political sphere is very important, because you need to be able to critically evaluate what is being fed to you. The second component is compassion and equality. Humans and other sentient beings are at the centre stage. Everyone to be treated equally with compassion. Morality is embedded in our genes and reinforced through our development. So while there's more room for compassion, democracies appear to fare better than autocracies. And once again, I bring up, the example that comes to mind is the war in Ukraine. The way that Ukrainian authorities are treating their soldiers is way different to the way Russians are treating their soldiers. So we can talk about that as well. Equality of ballots is more or less evident, particularly in Australia. We don't have, used to be a big problem with gerrymandering, not so much these days. We have an independent commission that does all this work, and generally the work of the commission that divides up the boundaries, the electoral boundaries, is accepted by both parties. In America, probably not so much, and that's why they have a lot of litigation. But there's other forms of inequality that still persist, especially economic, and there's some forms of political inequality. And then the final point is autonomy and dignity. People have a right to live without restrictions of governments and others to the maximum extent possible. Human rights and freedoms are critical for individuals to flourish and make positive contributions to society. The majority rule, tempered by institutional checks and balances as well as societal norms and conventions, is very important. And freedom of speech and association are fundamental building blocks for authentic democracies. So I'll leave it at that. And I just thought I'd share with you, on a bad day, Churchill would say something like, the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. And Churchill, on the balance of probabilities, many forms of government have been tried and will be tried in this world of sin and woe. No one pretends that democracy is perfect or all wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. Concluding remarks, we must be vigilant and take an active interest in our politics to minimise the risk of states becoming too powerful and coercive, people becoming too cynical, apathetic and stale, misinformation and disinformation distorting reality should be seen as our civic duty, not as Pericles put it. It's not about courage. It's about doing the right thing, and as Constant basically said, was the state will become coercive and take away our liberties if people become disinterested. And here, what I've got in mind is, which we haven't spoken about tonight, is the technology, the advance in technology is extremely intrusive into people's lives. And this technology is not just owned by government, but there's a lot of private sector interests out there. So that is starting to distort how our politics is practiced. So I'll stop there. I'm sorry for banging on for too long, but I'll open it up for questions and discussion.
Thank you very much, Vince. I'm sure everyone would like to join me to thank you for the wealth of expertise you shared with us.
Thank you.